Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at the world of private military contractors.
TMCs.
PMCs, yeah, in the Iraq War.
Right.
Specifically, focusing on Blackwater,
Yeah,
a name that has become pretty much synonymous with controversy these days.
definitely.
We've got this fascinating Brookings Institution report from 2007 called The Dark Truth About Blackwater, and we're going to be unpacking it.
It's going to be a wild ride.
It seems wild just thinking about, the sheer scale of PMCs that were involved.
Yeah.
By 2007, there were over 160,000 contractors in Iraq.
Wow.
To put that in perspective,
Yeah.
that's essentially a private army the size of the entire U.S. military presence
That's right.
at the time.
It completely changes how we think about modern warfare.
Right.
It wasn't just about logistics and support either.
Right.
These PMCs were involved in everything right up to armed combat.
Wow.
They essentially made the war possible on a practical level.
It's mind-boggling to consider how the war might have unfolded without them. I mean, imagine you're the U.S. government at the time,
Right.
facing mounting public pressure against the war.
Yeah.
PMCs offered a way to sidestep
Right.
the usual scrutiny that comes with deploying huge numbers of troops.
Exactly. And there's a historical parallel here.
Okay.
Remember the Abrams Doctrine?
Yes.
It was all about making sure the American public was on board with any war the U.S. entered.
Right.
Essentially, it was about getting buy-in for military action.
Yeah.
But PMCs allowed the government to circumvent that doctrine
Wow.
because their casualties weren't included in official counts.
So the public wasn't getting the full picture of the war's true cost.
No.
Does that sit right with you?
Emma.
Because it raises some serious questions about transparency and democratic accountability in wartime.
Absolutely. And things get even more complicated when we consider Blackwater's role in counterinsurgency efforts.
Okay.
The doctrine emphasizes winning over the local population, building trust and relationships, but some of Blackwater's actions seem to directly contradict those principles.
It's almost like a how-to guide on what not to do in counterinsurgency.
Right.
We're talking lavish bases, aggressive tactics,
Right.
things that might have been profitable but ultimately alienated the Iraqi people.
Yeah.
There's this crazy anecdote about PMCs literally using their machine guns, like car horns,
I've heard about that.
driving convoys on a wrong side of the road, total disregard for local norms.
And as Colonel Hams, an expert on counterinsurgency, put it, somebody's risking their life to deliver that luxury.
Right.
It really highlights this disconnect between the needs of the Iraqi people and the priorities of a for-profit military force.
It really makes you think about the long-term consequences of those actions, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
And then, of course, you have the Fallujah incident in 2004.
Right.
It's hard to overstate how significant that was.
Yeah.
4 Blackwater contractors were killed, and it led to a massive escalation of violence.
What's often overlooked is that the Marines initially had a plan for Fallujah, a classic counterinsurgency approach focused on winning over the population.
Right.
But public pressure after the Blackwater ambush and the horrific images of what happened to the contractors' bodies forced the Marines to abandon that plan.
And what followed was a full-scale assault on the city, a devastating turn of events.
Yeah.
There were significant civilian casualties.
Right.
And we saw the rise of al-Qaeda in Iraq, not to mention heavy U.S. losses in the fighting that followed.
Later, a lawsuit filed by the families of the deceased revealed Blackwater had sent those contractors on a rushed mission,
Wow.
ill-equipped and with inadequate planning.
Really?
It raises a crucial question. Was this a case of corporate negligence with massive strategic ramifications?
It's heavy stuff, and that's just the beginning.
Yeah.
Blackwater continued to make headlines, becoming increasingly notorious, especially among Iraqis.
Yeah.
Their aggressive tactics and perceived sense of impunity left a lasting impact.
We're talking about incidents where Blackwater employees allegedly shot and killed Iraqi civilians, sometimes seemingly without provocation, for instance. There was the Christmas Eve incident in 2006, where a Blackwater employee allegedly shot and killed an Iraqi vice president's guard
Oh, wow.
after a drunken argument and was flown out of the country without charges.
It's shocking, and it's no surprise this fueled immense anger and distrust between the U.S. and the Iraqi people.
Yeah.
One Iraqi official even described it as creating a powder keg.
And it's precisely that powder keg that leads us into the next part of our deep dive, how Blackwater's actions fed directly into the propaganda war.
Okay.
We'll pick up there next time.
Sounds good.
We were talking about that powder keg of anger
Right.
created by Blackwater's actions.
Yeah, it really makes you think about how those actions played right into the hands of,
Oh, yeah.
those who wanted to paint the U.S. in a negative light.
It's a perfect example of how even tactical victories can turn into strategic losses.
Right.
Remember, the goal in Iraq wasn't just about military dominance. It was also about winning the war of ideas, gaining the trust and support of the Iraqi people.
But instead of winning hearts and minds, it seems like Blackwater was doing the opposite,
Yeah.
becoming the symbol of everything many Iraqis resented about the U.S. presence.
Yeah, they practically handed anti-American groups a propaganda victory on a silver platter.
Exactly.
Right.
Think back to the Baghdad shootout.
Oh, yeah.
That incident was a gift to figures like Muqtada al-Sadr,
Right.
who used it to denounce the U.S. and portray Blackwater as the embodiment of American recklessness and disregard for Iraqi lives.
And his message resonated with a lot of people.
It wasn't just al-Sadr either.
Right.
The incident was all over the Arab media,
Yeah.
often with highly inflammatory language.
Of course.
Blackwater became this symbol of American arrogance and brutality, and that made it incredibly difficult to build any kind of trust with the Iraqi population.
And the fallout from those incidents raises an even bigger question about America's soft power and credibility on the global stage.
Yeah.
When we rely on PMCs like Blackwater, does it ultimately damage our ability to win hearts and minds and achieve our foreign policy objectives?
It's a crucial question. And the Brookings report goes even further, arguing that this reliance on PMCs has created a dangerous dependency
An addiction.
for the U.S. government.
Yeah.
It might be politically expedient in the short term, but it comes with long-term consequences.
The author calls it an addiction to a quick fix. We've outsourced so much that critical aspects of our security and foreign policy are now in the hands of private companies
Right.
whose interests don't always align with those of the American people.
It's like we've lost sight of what it means to have inherently governmental functions.
Right.
The idea that some tasks are just too important to be left to the private sector.
The report specifically calls for a return of those functions to government control.
Right.
And remember what Admiral Fallon, the CNTCOM commander at the time, said?
Yeah.
My instinct is that it's easier and better if they were in uniform and were working for me.
A powerful statement, and it really gets to the heart of the issue.
It does.
It makes you wonder if we've gone too far in outsourcing our security and foreign policy,
Yeah.
especially in an age of complex and unconventional warfare. Can democracies really afford to hand over such critical responsibilities to private entities?
It's a debate worth having, and it's not just about principles, it's also about practicality.
Right.
For all the talk about private sector efficiency, the evidence suggests that relying on PMCs can be incredibly expensive and often wasteful.
It's true. There was a House committee investigation that found over $10 billion
Wow.
in unsupported or questionable costs from battlefield contractors.
$10 billion.
Think of all the things that money could have been used for.
I know, right?
Better equipment for our troops, rebuilding infrastructure, humanitarian aid.
Right.
Things that might have actually helped win over the Iraqi people.
Absolutely. And sometimes it felt like the focus on profit came at the expense of the mission.
Right.
There's that story about contractors shipping sailboat fuel to Iraq instead of the fuel needed for military vehicles.
It really highlights how misplaced priorities can undermine the entire operation.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just fuel.
Right.
Remember, the bigger the bases, the more lavish the lifestyle, the more money these firms made.
Right.
But it also created more targets for insurgents
Of course.
and further alienated the local population. It's a vicious cycle.
It all feeds into the perception that the U.S. was more interested in occupation than liberation.
Yeah.
It made it that much harder to win over the Iraqi people.
It's a lot to take in, and it raises serious questions about the long-term implications of PMC involvement in conflicts.
Yeah.
Not just in Iraq, but globally, we're seeing the use of PMCs increase in other conflict zones.
It's true.
And we need to be having these tough conversations about accountability, transparency, and the potential risks involved. What are your thoughts on all this?
It's a lot to process, isn't it? The more we learn about Blackwater and the wider use of PMCs, the more questions it seems to raise.
Yeah, it's true. And the implications go way beyond just one company or one conflict. Right. We're talking about fundamental questions about the future of warfare, the role of private power, and the very nature of democratic accountability. It's like we're navigating uncharted territory here.
Absolutely. The lines between public and private military and civilian are all getting blurrier.
Yeah.
And it's easy to just shrug and accept that as the new normal, but I think that's a dangerous path.
I agree. We can't just sleepwalk into this new reality.
Right.
We need to be having a critical, open conversation about the role of PMCs in our foreign policy and national security strategies.
Yeah.
What are the trade-offs? What are the risks?
Yeah.
These aren't questions we should shy away from.
And the Brookings report offers a starting point for that conversation.
Yeah.
The author makes a strong case for bringing some of those inherently governmental functions back under government control.
Right.
It's about recognizing that some tasks are simply too important, too sensitive to be outsourced to the private sector. Exactly. Especially when those tasks involve things like the use of force intelligence gathering or other activities that can have huge consequences for our national interests.
Right.
We can't just throw money at the problem and hope it goes away. We need a real plan to rebuild expertise within government agencies, strengthen oversight, and bring these critical functions back in-house.
It's about reclaiming control, isn't it? Making sure that our values and our interests are guiding how we engage in conflicts around the world, that our actions match our rhetoric.
And a big part of that is fostering a public conversation about these issues, not just in Washington, D.C., but in communities across the country, in classrooms, around dinner tables, wherever people are grappling with these tough questions.
Because at the end of the day, it's not just about whether PMCs can perform certain tasks, it's about whether they should.
Right.
And that's a decision that should be made by an informed public, not by corporate boardrooms or government agencies operating in the shadows.
Well said. And as technology continues to advance, the nature of warfare is constantly transforming. We're already seeing the rise of artificial intelligence, drone warfare, cyber capabilities, all these new tools that are changing the landscape of conflict.
It makes you wonder how the role of PMCs will evolve in this new environment. Will we see private companies playing an even greater role in shaping conflicts? Will the ethical and strategic dilemmas we've been discussing become even more complex and urgent?
Those are questions worth pondering, and hopefully this deep dive has given you some new perspectives on this important issue, maybe even sparked some questions of your own.
We always encourage you to learn more, share your thoughts, and stay engaged in these critical conversations. The choices we made today about the role of private military contractors will have a profound impact on the future of warfare and the shape of global power for generations to come. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.